My name is Hannah, and at 30 years old, I had just completed the most expensive and ultimately the most regrettable transaction of my entire life. Sitting in the sleek glass conference room of a downtown Chicago real estate firm, I signed the final transfer documents for a sprawling $9,800,000 mansion located in the heart of the Gold Coast. The purchase was entirely discreet, executed through a blind limited liability company directly connected to a private trust fund I had established years ago. To the outside world, and more specifically to my husband Derek and his family, I was nothing more than a struggling online merchant who sold handmade crafts and digital templates from a cramped corner of our suburban living room. They viewed my daily hours spent behind a computer screen as a pathetic hobby, a desperate attempt to contribute to a household where Derek, a mid-tier credit director at a local bank, loudly proclaimed himself the sole provider. What they completely failed to comprehend was that my modest online storefront was merely a decoy, a convenient cover story designed to protect my true life's work. Over the past decade, I had quietly engineered and launched a financial technology platform that revolutionized e-commerce payment gateways for independent vendors worldwide. That supposed little hobby had quietly evolved into a billion-dollar unicorn company operating entirely under the radar of my status-obsessed in-laws. I wore oversized sweaters, drove a 7-year-old sedan, and allowed my husband to experience the fragile ego boost of paying our utility bills, while my corporate holding accounts accumulated wealth that his entire banking department could only dream of managing. My immense financial success was my closely guarded secret, born from a deep-seated desire to be loved for who I was, rather than what I could provide. However, my affection for my husband and his family had eventually overridden my caution. The magnificent Gold Coast Smart Mansion was meant to be the ultimate olive branch, a grand gesture of love and inclusion. It featured imported Italian marble floors, cascading crystal chandeliers, biometric security doors, and a state-of-the-art climate control system. My intention was to offer the spectacular estate as the ultimate luxury venue for my sister-in-law Vanessa and her upcoming wedding. Furthermore, I had planned to quietly transfer the property into a trust for my mother-in-law, Beatrice serving as her permanent retirement sanctuary. Beatrice was a woman utterly consumed by the illusion of high society, possessing a relentless hunger for prestige that vastly exceeded her actual bank account. She spent her days meticulously curating a facade of generational wealth, desperate to climb the social ladder, and constantly belittling anyone she deemed beneath her elevated standards. This desperate need for validation had reached a fever pitch with Vanessa's engagement to Jamal. Jamal was a brilliant 30-year-old entrepreneur, hailing from a highly respected, incredibly affluent African-American family, known for their extensive philanthropic work and deep roots in the city's intellectual elite. His parents carried themselves with effortless grace and genuine sophistication, a stark contrast to Beatrice's frantic social climbing. Terrified of being exposed as ordinary, Beatrice had spent the last 6 months orchestrating an elaborate web of lies about our family's financial standing, stretching Derek's credit to the absolute limit to fund luxury dinners and designer wardrobes just to keep up appearances. The mansion was supposed to be my silent gift to alleviate their crushing financial anxiety and give them the genuine security they were actively destroying their lives to fake. With the property deeds safely secured in my leather briefcase, I drove back to the modest, slightly cramped 3-bedroom house I shared with Derek. The contrast between the architectural masterpiece I had just purchased and the reality of my daily life was jarring. The front door stuck slightly as I pushed it open, a maintenance issue Derek continually promised to fix, but conveniently ignored. The house was quiet, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, and that was when I noticed the thick gold-embossed envelopes resting on the granite countertop. They were Vanessa's official wedding invitations, printed on heavy premium cardstock with intricate calligraphy that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Curious to see the final design, I slid one of the spare invitations out of its unsealed envelope. My eyes scanned the beautifully scripted itinerary, detailing the rehearsal dinner, the grand ceremony, and the lavish reception. I looked down at the formal guest list printed on the enclosed reception card. I read the names of Derek's extended family, his colleagues, and even distant neighbors. I scanned the list a second time and then a third. My name was entirely absent. I was explicitly omitted from every single event associated with the wedding of my own sister-in-law. A cold, heavy sensation settled in the pit of my stomach as the reality of the printed words sank in. Before I could fully process the depth of the insult, the sound of a key turning in the front lock echoed through the hallway. Derek strode into the house carrying a garment bag from an obscenely expensive downtown tailor. He moved with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed the world owed him deference simply for existing. He barely glanced in my direction as he draped the heavy protective bag carefully over the back of the dining chair, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing frozen, clutching the wedding invitation in my trembling hands. I stepped forward and presented the gold-embossed card, asking him directly for an explanation regarding my missing name. Derek did not flinch or offer a frantic apology. Instead, he physically brushed past me, moving toward the hallway mirror to admire his reflection and adjust the cuffs of his dress shirt. Without a single trace of empathy or remorse, he delivered his response with devastating clinical precision. He informed me that his mother, Beatrice, had made an executive decision to exclude me from the wedding festivities entirely. He explained that my presence was simply too much of a liability for their carefully constructed image. He continued adjusting his collar while methodically tearing down my self-worth, stating that I was a fundamental embarrassment to the family. He categorized me as a low-class, raggedy online seller who lacked the basic refinement required to sit in the same room as Jamal's elite, highly educated family. I insisted that my lack of a real corporate career and my refusal to dress in expensive designer labels would expose their family to ridicule and ultimately humiliate them in front of their wealthy future in-laws. He made it painfully that my existence in his life was a burden he was no longer willing to carry into public spaces, especially when the stakes for his family's social climbing were this high. I stood paralyzed, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his cruelty. For years, I had played the role of the supportive, quiet wife, absorbing Beatrice's passive-aggressive comments and Vanessa's outright disdain because I believed that love required patience. I had suppressed my own brilliance, minimized my towering success, and hidden my vast empire just to protect the fragile ego of the man standing before me. I had literally just spent millions of dollars in cash to secure a future for people who viewed me as nothing more than a stain on their fabricated pedigree. Instead of bursting into tears, instead of screaming about the injustice of his words, or begging for my rightful place by his side, I felt the last lingering threads of my affection for him wither and die. A profound, chilling composure washed over me, extinguishing the warmth I had harbored for our marriage. The emotional devastation instantly transformed into absolute icy clarity. I looked at the man I had promised to spend my life with, recognizing him not as a partner, but as a parasitic fraud who was utterly blind to the reality of his own existence. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my honor. I did not reveal the contents of my briefcase or mention the spectacular estate sitting in the Gold Coast, waiting for their arrival. I simply looked him directly in the eyes, nodded my head in calm acknowledgement, and communicated that his message was perfectly understood. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him to preen in front of the mirror, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic miscalculation he had just made. I retreated to my small, designated home office, locking the door quietly behind me. I sat down at my worn wooden desk and opened the secure encrypted master control tablet hidden beneath a stack of mundane shipping invoices. The screen glowed to life, displaying the complex administrative dashboard for the newly purchased $9,800,000 smart mansion. With methodical precision, I navigated to the user access portal containing the digital profiles I had previously established for Beatrice, Derek, and Vanessa. I selected all of their profiles simultaneously. Without a single moment of hesitation, I initiated a total system override, permanently revoking their administrative privileges, canceling their biometric access, and completely locking down the primary climate and security mainframes. The digital dominoes began to fall, and I sat back in the quiet darkness, waiting for their magnificent illusions to completely shatter. Miles away in the affluent neighborhood of the Gold Coast, Beatrice and Vanessa were actively performing their grandest illusion. They had invited Jamal and his esteemed parents over for an exclusive evening tour of what Beatrice proudly claimed was her newly acquired estate. The African-American couple, known for their understated elegance and genuine philanthropic wealth, walked through the magnificent entryway, politely observing the opulent Italian marble and the cascading crystal chandeliers. Beatrice strutted ahead, gesturing wildly to the architectural details, taking full credit for the impeccable taste and limitless budget required to secure such a property. She pointed toward the grand dining hall, her face flushed with the thrill of finally feeling superior to her future in-laws. Vanessa trailed right behind her, mirroring the haughty posture of her mother, reveling in the validation of her fabricated upper-class status. But the illusion was operating on borrowed time. Just as Beatrice motioned toward the climate-controlled wine cellar, the master override I had initiated from my modest home office took effect. The transition was instant and unforgiving. The brilliant ambient lighting lining the vaulted ceiling snapped off, plunging the grand hallway into sudden disorienting darkness. The emergency backup lights flickered on, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the imported artwork. Before Beatrice could formulate a coherent excuse, the heavy biometric security doors sealing the main hall slammed shut with a resounding mechanical thud, effectively locking the entire party out of the primary entertainment spaces. The automated climate control system, previously set to a comfortable ambient warmth, instantly reset to its security baseline. Ice-cold air began blasting from the central vents, chilling the massive room. Beatrice scrambled toward the digital wall panels, frantically tapping the blank glass screens completely locked out of the system. She stood shivering in the dim emergency lighting, her elaborate facade dissolving into pure, unadulterated humiliation, right in front of Jamal and his highly respected parents, who merely exchanged quiet, observant glances. The fallout reached me less than 20 minutes later. I was already pulling a large suitcase from the top shelf of my bedroom closet when my phone began vibrating aggressively against the nightstand. The caller identification displayed the name of my husband. I accepted the call and placed the device on speaker, setting it down on the mattress while I calmly began folding my clothes. Derek was in a state of absolute unhinged panic. He unleashed a torrent of furious accusations, completely bypassing any standard greeting. His voice echoed through the bedroom, demanding that I immediately contact whatever cheap discount contractors I had hired to install the home systems. He aggressively complained that the entire property had malfunctioned, trapping his mother and her guests in a freezing hallway, turning a crucial social event into an absolute disaster. He blamed my supposed incompetence for the technical failure, ordering me to drop whatever useless online crafting I was doing and fix the mess. He genuinely still believed I was just the lowly organizer who had managed the paperwork, fundamentally incapable of comprehending that I held the absolute deed to the property. I continued packing with slow, deliberate precision. I folded my modest, oversized sweaters and comfortable jeans, the very garments he constantly ridiculed, placing them neatly into my luggage. I listened to his frantic, commanding tone, absorbing the sheer arrogance of a man ordering his wife to rescue the very illusion he was using to exclude her. I offered no confirmation, no apologies, and absolutely no solutions. I simply let his voice echo into the empty room until he grew frustrated with my silence and abruptly disconnected the call. The silence that followed was profoundly peaceful. The emotional paralysis that had gripped me earlier was completely gone, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. I was not just packing my clothes, I was systematically dismantling my presence in his life. Moving to the opposite side of the bedroom, I began clearing out the remaining storage compartments, wanting to ensure I left no personal documents behind. As I reached into the upper shelving unit above the meticulously organized shoe collection, my hand brushed against a loose wooden panel at the back of the cabinet. It shifted slightly under my weight. My curiosity piqued, I pressed my fingers against the edge of the wood and pushed. The panel popped open, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment built directly into the shelving structure. Inside the dark cavity lay a small velvet jewelry box and a folded piece of paper. I pulled the items into the light. The paper was a physical receipt from an incredibly exclusive downtown jeweler, the kind of establishment that required an appointment just to view their inventory. The date on the receipt was from 2 weeks ago, and the total amount charged was staggering, nearly equal to what Derek claimed he earned in 3 months at the bank. The item purchased was a diamond tennis bracelet, a piece of jewelry I had certainly never received. I opened the small velvet box expecting to find the bracelet inside. Instead, resting on the dark cushion was a single highly distinct platinum cufflink engraved with a unique crest. It was heavy, expensive, and completely mismatched to anything Derek owned or would ever wear. The cufflink did not belong to him. It was a leftover artifact, perhaps accidentally swapped or deliberately kept, pointing toward a life he was leading entirely outside of our marriage. I returned to the bedroom and zipped my suitcase shut, feeling lighter than I had in years. The house that had felt like a cage just hours ago now simply felt like a waiting room for my inevitable departure. I placed the platinum cufflink and the jewelry receipt securely into my designer handbag, making sure the physical evidence was safe. I did not need to leave a dramatic note or stage an emotional confrontation. The quiet exit would unnerve him far more than any screaming match ever could. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors, and paused by the front door. I glanced around the living room one last time, taking in the cheap furnishings and the cramped space that Derek had constantly complained about. He had always blamed my online business for holding him back from the luxury he believed he deserved. Little did he know I was the only thing standing between him and total destruction. I pulled the door shut behind me, the lock clicking into place with absolute and definitive finality. As I stepped out into the freezing cold evening air, my phone vibrated with a text message, suddenly confirming my private vehicle arriving at the curb. The rules had permanently changed. The sleek black town car idled at the curb, its engine a low, steady hum in the freezing Chicago air. I slid into the leather interior, leaving the frozen suburban street and my fabricated life behind. The driver, a trusted employee from my corporate security detail, nodded respectfully and navigated us toward the downtown core. My destination was not a cheap motel or a friend's spare bedroom. I directed him to the penthouse suite of a premier luxury hotel, a property where my holding company maintained a permanent corporate account. The suite was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. It was the exact kind of wealth Derek spent his days pretending to possess. I bypassed the complimentary champagne resting in a silver bucket and walked straight to the massive glass dining table. I retrieved my encrypted laptop from my bag and initiated a secure satellite connection. The time for sorrow had passed, and the hour for absolute financial dissection had arrived. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard security protocols of Derek's banking institution. He was a mid-tier credit director who believed his basic alphanumeric passwords provided ironclad protection. His arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. I used the same variation of his birth year and his mother's maiden name for every single account he managed. Within 4 minutes, I had penetrated his personal banking firewall. I mapped out his entire financial footprint, displaying the data across my screen in a cascading waterfall of numbers and dates. The extent of his deceit was mathematically staggering. He had established a secondary shadow account, linking it to a high-interest line of credit that was currently maxed out. I pulled the detailed transaction logs, verifying every purchase he had made over the past 8 months. I watched the progress bar inch forward across the screen, downloading every single digital receipt into an encrypted folder on my local drive. The screen illuminated a pathetic trail of desperation. There were recurring charges for 5-star hotel suites, weekend getaways to coastal resorts, and exorbitant dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. The amounts were grotesque, especially considering he frequently complained about the cost of our household groceries. He had been purchasing imported caviar and vintage wine while demanding I use coupons for laundry detergent. I initiated a reverse trace on the routing numbers connected to the wire transfers he had been sending. I needed to see the full scope of the parasite he was funding. The data packets resolved confirming the identity of the woman receiving his stolen money. Her name was Paige. A sharp bark of laughter escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet penthouse. The sheer astronomical irony of his choice in a mistress was almost too perfect to believe. Paige was not an anonymous stranger. She was a former junior intern who had been unceremoniously terminated from one of my primary subsidiary companies exactly 3 months ago. I vividly remembered signing off on her termination paperwork. My compliance division had caught her attempting to embezzle a low-level corporate marketing fund to pay for designer handbags. She had manipulated our accounting software, using a backdoor code that my engineers detected within 48 hours. Now she was using those same manipulation tactics to extract wealth from a man who was entirely blinded by his own towering ego. She was a documented fraudster, a grifter who lacked both intelligence and subtlety. Derek had drained his life savings and leveraged his professional credit to impress a woman who was legally barred from entering my corporate lobbies. He believed he was living a high-stakes double life, but in reality, he was just another mark for a desperate con artist. He was destroying his marriage, his career, and his financial future for a woman who was literally stealing from the very empire his wife had built. The data logs showed that Paige was bleeding him dry. The velvet jewelry box receipt I had found in his closet was just the beginning. He had even used our joint checking account to pay for the expedited shipping on a pair of designer sunglasses sent directly to her address. There were charges for luxury spa days, overseas shopping sprees, and a highly suspicious down payment on a luxury sports car lease. Derek was actively committing severe credit fraud, leveraging the assets of the bank he worked for to maintain this absurd fantasy. I was securing massive personal loans under false pretenses, convinced he could manipulate the system indefinitely. He was a fool dancing on a financial landmine, and he had no idea that I held the detonator. The morning sun breached the horizon, casting a brilliant golden light across the city. I closed my laptop, having secured every piece of evidence necessary to ensure his absolute ruin. I walked into the sprawling marble bathroom and stared at my reflection in the massive mirror. The woman looking back at me was wearing a faded, oversized sweater and practical denim jeans. It was the uniform of the quiet, supportive wife, the embarrassing online seller who knew her place in the background of Derek's life. I reached down, grabbed the hem of the sweater, and pulled it over my head, throwing it forcefully into the nearest trash receptacle. The jeans followed immediately after. The persona of the meek suburban housewife was dead. The billionaire chief executive officer was finally stepping into the light. I contacted my personal concierge team and issued a swift set of instructions. Within 2 hours, a private styling team arrived at my hotel suite carrying garment bags from the most exclusive designer boutiques in the city. I dismissed the soft pastels and the comfortable knits, demanding structured architectural silhouettes. I selected a stunning razor-sharp designer suit in a deep, commanding charcoal gray. The tailoring was immaculate, hugging my frame with aggressive precision. The jacket featured sharp, assertive shoulders, and the trousers fell perfectly over a pair of imposing black stiletto heels. The fabric alone cost more than Derek's prized custom suit. I allowed the makeup artist to accentuate my features, swapping my usual bare-faced look for a sharp, sophisticated contour and a bold, unapologetic red lip. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style that left absolutely no room for softness. The transformation was an essential psychological shift, marking the end of my tolerance for their continuous disrespect. I added a subtle spritz of an expensive, rare perfume that carried notes of bergamot and cedar, completely masking the faint scent of the suburban life I had just abandoned. When I stood before the full-length mirror, I did not recognize the woman who had cried over a wedding invitation 24 hours ago. I looked like power. I looked like consequence. I looked like a woman who could buy and sell her husband's entire existence before her morning coffee. Fully armored in my newfound identity, I returned to my laptop to execute the next phase of my strategy. I needed to know exactly where Beatrice and Vanessa were hiding. The grand wedding was rapidly approaching, and the schedule of events had been meticulously planned. I pulled up the digital calendar attached to Vanessa's wedding planner, an account I had easily compromised earlier that morning. The itinerary loaded, displaying the schedule for the weekend. Tonight was the exclusive rehearsal dinner, an intimate high society gathering designed to officially introduce Jamal's elite family to Vanessa's relatives. The venue was listed as a premier, highly exclusive restaurant located in the historic district, a place known for its strict dress code and impossible reservation waitlist. Beatrice had likely drained the last of her available credit to secure the private dining room, desperate to maintain the illusion of their fabricated wealth. They were going to sit in a room full of genuine billionaires and pretend they belonged. They were going to toast to family and loyalty while actively excluding the woman who had unknowingly financed their entire charade. I checked the time on my diamond-encrusted watch, a piece I had kept hidden in a safe deposit box for years. The dinner was scheduled to begin in exactly 2 hours. The timing was absolutely flawless. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my private security team. The driver answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and professional. I instructed him to bring the executive town car to the front entrance of the hotel immediately. I grabbed my designer clutch, sliding the printed financial logs, the evidence of Derek's fraud, and the legal deed inside. I walked out of the penthouse suite, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing with a steady, relentless rhythm against the marble floor. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, sealing my resolve. I was crashing Vanessa's rehearsal dinner. They would never know. The establishment was a fortress of exclusivity, known for an impossible reservation list and an atmosphere dripping with old money prestige. I stepped inside, leaving the freezing city winds behind. The ambient lighting cast a warm golden hue over the imported mahogany paneling and the plush velvet seating arrangements. My stilettos clicked against the polished marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic authority. I no longer moved like the background character of my own life. Wrapped in the immaculate tailoring of my charcoal gray designer suit, I moved with the precise, calculated grace of a woman who controlled empires. The hostess barely glanced at my lack of a reservation before immediately stepping aside, intimidated by the sheer gravity of my newfound presence. I navigated through the main dining room, scanning the softly lit alcoves. The rehearsal dinner was taking place in a semi-private section near the back, elevated slightly above the rest of the patrons. I spotted them instantly. Vanessa sat at the center of the long table, performing her role as the blushing bride-to-be while sipping champagne. Beatrice hovered nearby, adjusting floral centerpieces and barking hushed orders at the waitstaff. Derek stood near the private bar, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, projecting the false image of a highly successful banking executive. They were entirely in their element, surrounded by luxury they could not actually afford, desperately clinging to the illusion of their elevated social status. It took exactly 12 seconds for Beatrice to notice my arrival. I watched from across the room as her gaze swept over the crowd and landed on my figure. The color instantly drained from her heavily powdered face. Her champagne flute froze halfway to her lips. She tapped Derek on the shoulder, gesturing frantically in my direction. Derek turned, and his expression morphed from arrogant complacency to absolute horror. The woman they had spent years dismissing as a raggedy, uncultured burden was standing in the middle of their exclusive event, looking more powerful and refined than anyone else in the room. They did not hesitate. Derek and Beatrice abandoned their drinks and marched aggressively toward the edge of the alcove, intercepting me before I could reach the main table. Derek positioned his body to block my path, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. His face was flushed with anger. He leaned in close, hissing demands through gritted teeth. He ordered me to turn around and walk out the door immediately. He accused me of trying to sabotage his sister's flawless evening out of pure, petty jealousy. He explicitly stated that my presence was a catastrophic mistake that would ruin the pristine aesthetic they had worked so tirelessly to cultivate for Jamal's family. Beatrice flanked him, nodding in furious agreement. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting nervously around the restaurant to ensure no one was witnessing this confrontation. She whispered viciously about my absolute lack of shame. She threatened to call the restaurant security team and have me forcibly removed for trespassing. She reminded me that I did not belong in this tier of society, and that my attempt to crash a high society dinner was the ultimate proof of my embarrassing low-class nature. I stood my ground, allowing their desperate, hostile energy to wash over me without reacting. I did not flinch or defend myself. I did not justify my presence. I simply maintained a cold, steady gaze, observing them with the detached fascination of a scientist examining a dying specimen. Their panic was palpable. They were terrified that my mere existence would shatter the fragile house of cards they had built. They continued their hushed, aggressive tirade, desperate to force my retreat before the guests of honor arrived. Before Beatrice could flag down a passing manager to execute her threat to have me remove the atmosphere at the front of the restaurant shifted. The heavy oak doors opened once more, and the ambient chatter in the lobby naturally quieted. Jamal walked in accompanied by his parents. They were a striking, incredibly distinguished African-American family who commanded respect effortlessly. Jamal's father carried the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who possessed genuine generational wealth and immense corporate success. His mother radiated a calm, elegant grace, wearing a deeply sophisticated gown that made Beatrice's expensive outfit look suddenly cheap and unrefined. They moved through the lobby with the kind of comfortable confidence that could never be fabricated. The moment Beatrice spotted the wealthy in-laws, her entire demeanor underwent a violent whiplash. She instantly abandoned her aggressive posture toward me, smoothing her features into a mask of cloying, exaggerated delight. She pushed past Derek, practically shoving him out of the way, as she rushed toward the front of the restaurant to intercept the arriving guests. She prepared to launch into her subservient fawning routine, eager to cement her status by associating with their undeniable prestige. She extended her arms, preparing to welcome them to the exclusive dinner she claimed to have organized. But Jamal's parents did not return the gesture. They did not even acknowledge Beatrice's outstretched arms or her frantic, welcoming smile. Their attention was entirely captivated by something else. As they walked deeper into the dining room, their eyes locked onto my figure standing just behind Derek. The polite, socially obligatory expressions on their faces vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed shock and profound, unadulterated reverence. They bypassed Beatrice, completely leaving her standing frozen with her arms awkwardly suspended in the air. They walked directly toward me, moving with a hurried, purposeful pace that drew the attention of everyone in the immediate vicinity. Jamal's father reached me first, extending both of his hands to grasp mine with a level of deference usually reserved for visiting royalty. His mother followed immediately, embracing me with genuine warmth and immense respect. Beatrice and Derek stood paralyzed, their minds entirely incapable of processing the scene unfolding right in front of their eyes. Jamal's father spoke with a rich, booming voice that carried effortlessly across the quieted restaurant. He bypassed all casual pleasantries and addressed me directly by my formal executive title. He called me Madam Founder, expressing his absolute astonishment and deep honor at finding me at this private family event. He did not lower his voice as he expressed his profound gratitude for the monumental financial partnership my technology enterprise had recently finalized with his global investment portfolio. He praised my visionary leadership, crediting my brilliant corporate strategy for single-handedly shifting the dynamics of the entire e-commerce market. He stated that his firm's recent success was entirely due to the massive infrastructure my company had provided. The silence that fell over the semi-private alcove was absolute and deafening. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and background music seemed to completely evaporate. Every single guest at the rehearsal dinner, including Vanessa and her bridesmaids, turned to stare at the interaction. Jamal stood a few paces away, looking at me with a mixture of awe and dawning realization. The words hung in the air, heavy with undeniable truth. The man they were desperately trying to impress was openly declaring his subservience to my financial empire. I glanced at Derek and Beatrice. They were physically paralyzed. The cognitive dissonance was actively short-circuiting their reality. The woman they had just spent 10 minutes threatening to throw out into the street, the woman they had mocked for years as a pathetic, raggedy online seller, was currently being hailed as a billionaire titan of industry by the very people they worshipped. The realization of my immense hidden wealth and towering corporate power hit them like a physical blow. Derek's arrogant posture crumbled entirely. His broad shoulders slumped and his face turned the color of ash. He stared at my designer suit, finally understanding that it was not a costume, but the uniform of my true daily life. He realized in real time that the woman he had been cheating on and belittling was the architect of an empire he could not even fathom. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His brain simply could not process the catastrophic magnitude of his error. Beatrice was faring even worse. Her meticulously powdered face twisted into a mask of pure terror. She realized instantly that her entire social standing, her financial security, and her future rested in the hands of the woman she had relentlessly abused for years. The sheer panic in her eyes was intoxicating to witness. She recognized that the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely obliterated. She was standing in the presence of a predator, and she was the prey. Desperation took over. Beatrice scrambled to recover her footing, launching into a frantic, disjointed performance. She stepped forward, stammering out a clumsy, pathetic apology. She attempted to weave a brand new narrative right on the spot, pretending that her earlier hostility and the missing wedding invitation were merely a terrible logistical misunderstanding. She reached out, trying to touch my arm, attempting to play the role of the proud, affectionate mother-in-law, who was simply overwhelmed by the surprise of seeing me. She babbled incoherently about family bonds and how thrilled she was that we could all celebrate together as one completely united and happy household. I ignored her pathetic performance completely and thoroughly. I did not acknowledge her trembling apology or validate her sudden display of frantic affection. Instead, I maintained eye contact with Jamal's father, sharing a brief professional nod, acknowledging his immense respect. Then I slowly turned my absolute attention back to Beatrice. I reached my left hand deep into the sleek, dark interior of my heavy designer clutch. My fingers instantly found the crisp, thick parchment I had meticulously prepared earlier that very afternoon. With slow, unyielding, and highly deliberate precision, I withdrew a sharply folded, legally binding document. I held it for a brief, tense moment, ensuring Beatrice's terrified, wide gaze was securely locked onto the imposing legal paper. Then, with a smooth, cold, calculated motion, I slid the heavy document aggressively across the pristine white restaurant tablecloth, pushing it directly into her violently trembling hands. She stared down at the crisp pages, completely unaware that this singular piece of paper would permanently shatter her entire fabricated existence and initiate the absolute unrelenting destruction of her highly coveted social standing, forever erasing her name from the elite circles she so desperately craved to join. The heavy silence in the room stretched into an unbearable eternity as Beatrice stared down at the crisp legal document resting against the white linen tablecloth. Her manicured fingers trembled violently, causing the thick parchment to vibrate against the crystal glassware. The elegant embossed seal of my primary corporate law firm caught the ambient light, serving as a physical manifestation of my absolute authority. Without raising my voice, I methodically explained the exact nature of the paperwork she was holding. I outlined with absolute clinical precision that the document was a formal 24-hour notice of eviction. I detailed how the $9,800,000 estate she had been parading around as her own personal acquisition was in fact entirely owned by a blind corporate entity under my direct and exclusive control. I clarified that her presence in the mansion was legally categorized as a temporary short-term tenancy. I further elaborated that this tenancy was now permanently terminated due to a severe breach of character and an utter lack of basic respect. I ensured that every single syllable was perfectly enunciated, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation or debate regarding her impending removal from the premises. I watched the blood completely drain from Beatrice's face as the crushing reality of her situation took hold. The opulent world she had meticulously fabricated to impress Jamal's affluent family was disintegrating before her very eyes. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, panicked gasps of air while clutching her expensive pearl necklace, as if the jewelry could somehow anchor her to the vanishing illusion. Her desperate gaze darted around the semi-private alcove, seeking any possible avenue of escape or denial, but finding absolutely nothing except cold judgment. The facade of generational wealth she had worn like impenetrable armor had been stripped away, leaving her exposed as a desperate, opportunistic fraud. The sheer magnitude of the humiliation paralyzed her physical movements, pinning her to the chair while the guests of honor silently observed her spectacular downward spiral into absolute social destitution. The atmospheric shift at the main table was immediate and devastating. Jamal, a man of profound intellect and unwavering integrity, slowly turned his attention away from the staggering spectacle of Beatrice's collapse and focused his piercing gaze directly onto Vanessa. The pieces of the elaborate deception were rapidly assembling in his highly analytical mind. I observed the exact moment his underlying confusion solidified into deep-seated suspicion. He began demanding explanations regarding the true nature of their financial standing, questioning the endless boasts and the extravagant promises that had characterized their entire courtship. Vanessa visibly shrank under his intense scrutiny, her previous haughty demeanor completely vanishing. She stammered and deflected, attempting to weave a new layer of lies to protect her crumbling engagement, but her frantic efforts only deepened Jamal's glaring mistrust. Jamal's parents maintained their dignified silence, but their rigid posture conveyed volumes. They were witnessing the utter moral bankruptcy of the family. Their son was preparing to join, and their profound disappointment was palpable. Sensing the absolute destruction of his family's reputation, Derek finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. His initial shock rapidly mutated into an aggressive, desperate rage. He stepped forward, positioning himself aggressively close to my physical space, in a pathetic attempt to reassert his deeply fractured dominance. His face was contorted with fury as he began to unleash a barrage of loud, desperate legal threats. He vehemently declared that my hidden wealth would not remain mine for long. He aggressively outlined his misguided belief that standard marital property laws would guarantee him 50% of my entire corporate empire. He boasted about hiring the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the city, promising to drag my businesses through endless litigation until he extracted every single dollar he felt entitled to. He painted a detailed picture of the alimony and spousal support he planned to extract, entirely convinced that the legal system would validate his greed. I stood perfectly still, allowing his hollow threats to wash over me without reacting. I did not bother to correct his deeply flawed understanding of asset protection, or mention the impenetrable web of blind trusts and undisclosed prenuptial agreements I had executed long before our wedding day. I merely observed the grotesque manifestation of his greed, realizing that his anger stemmed not from the loss of our marriage, but from the perceived loss of his newly discovered jackpot. I was attempting to weaponize the legal system against the very woman he had been actively deceiving and stealing from. He was actively threatening a billionaire chief executive officer while standing in a restaurant. He could barely afford, completely blind to the fact that I held the power to eradicate his entire professional existence with a single keystroke. Rather than engaging in a vulgar screaming match, I pivoted my attention toward the hovering restaurant management staff. With a subtle, commanding nod, I summoned the head waiter, who approached with cautious hesitation, given the explosive tension radiating from our table. I smoothly reached into my designer clutch and retrieved a heavy matte black corporate credit card holding an unlimited spending threshold. I instructed the waiter to process the payment for the entire extravagant rehearsal dinner immediately, including all top-tier wine selections, imported delicacies, and upcoming dessert courses that had yet to be served. I further specified that he should add an astronomical gratuity to the final total, ensuring the restaurant staff were heavily compensated for dealing with the miserable spectacle my in-laws had created. The waiter processed the transaction with wide eyes, handing me the leather folio to provide my final authorizing signature. I signed the receipt with a flourish, feeling a profound sense of closure as the ink dried on the parchment. I was purchasing my freedom from their exhausting, endless drama. Derek's jaw tightened as he watched me effortlessly dismiss the massive financial burden he had been sweating over all evening. By paying the bill, I had stripped away the absolute last remnant of his false authority, completely emasculating his role as the supposed wealthy patriarch. I retrieved my black card from the astonished waiter and returned it to my clutch. I offered Derek a cold, serene smile, conveying my absolute indifference to his legal threats. I silently welcomed him to test his luck in divorce court, inviting him to try and breach the fortress of my corporate infrastructure. I challenged him with my eyes, daring him to initiate the legal battle he was so confidently projecting. I knew with absolute certainty that his impending legal efforts would result in nothing but his own catastrophic ruin. I adjusted the lapels of my designer suit, ensuring my posture remained completely immaculate as I prepared to make my final departure. Turning my back on the sputtering rage of my husband and the hyperventilating panic of his mother, I walked away from the table. I moved with the same steady rhythmic grace that had marked my arrival, completely unaffected by the chaotic wreckage I was leaving behind. The hushed whispers of the surrounding elite patrons parted like the sea, allowing me to exit the dining room with absolute unbothered dignity. The frigid winter night air felt incredibly refreshing as I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out onto the historic city street. My private security detail immediately swung the door of the waiting town car wide open. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, the quiet hum of the engine providing a stark contrast to the screaming chaos inside the restaurant. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the downtown traffic, I retrieved my encrypted mobile device from my bag. I had one final operational task to execute before I could allow myself to rest. I opened a secure, untraceable communication channel routing the signal through multiple international servers to ensure complete anonymity. I compiled the devastating digital dossier I had extracted from Derek's compromised banking interface earlier that morning. The file contained undeniable time-stamped proof of his severe credit manipulation, the fraudulent asset leveraging, and the unauthorized high-interest loans he had secured using his banking employer's internal systems. I directed the encrypted data packet straight to the Executive Compliance Division of the financial institution where Derek held his directorship. I meticulously detailed the exact nature of his internal embezzlement, highlighting the specific regulatory breaches that mandated immediate federal reporting. I watched the progress bar hit 100%, confirming the successful transmission of the anonymous tip. The digital payload had breached the bank's internal security network, landing directly in the inbox of the chief risk officer. The mechanisms for his professional and legal destruction were now officially in motion. By the time Derek managed to drag his shattered ego into his office the following morning, the entire compliance department would be waiting for him. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was swallowed, and the jaws of consequence were poised to snap shut. The morning sun crested over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished floor of my executive boardroom. I sat perfectly still behind the expansive tempered glass desk, sipping a bitter espresso, while the city awoke far below. The digital trap I had laid the previous night was already tightening its unrelenting grip around my husband, but he remained entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality hurtling toward him. In his mind, he still held the absolute upper hand. He genuinely believed his mid-level position at the bank and his newly hired legal muscle would easily overwhelm whatever modest little enterprise I had managed to build. I had sent a courier to the luxury hotel where he was temporarily seeking refuge with Beatrice, delivering a formal legal summons to my corporate address for a preliminary asset dissolution meeting. I watched the live security feed on my monitor as Derek confidently strode through the revolving doors of the towering downtown skyscraper. He was accompanied by a man carrying a sleek leather briefcase, radiating the kind of predatory arrogance typical of high-priced aggressive divorce attorneys. Derek wore his signature tailored suit, his chest puffed out, projecting a pathetic image of absolute control. They navigated the pristine marble lobby, displaying expressions of smug superiority, likely assuming I rented a tiny windowless room in some cheap shared co-working space on a forgotten lower floor. The high-definition security footage captured the exact moment their arrogant assumptions began to aggressively fracture. The building concierge politely bypassed the standard public elevators and escorted the two men to a private biometric lift reserved exclusively for the building's primary executive tenants. When the heavy steel doors glided open on the 42nd floor, Derek and his attorney stepped out into a sprawling state-of-the-art corporate headquarters. The reception area alone was larger and far more opulent than the entire suburban house we had shared for years. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking panoramic views of Lake Michigan, while sleek digital displays tracked global market trends and real-time electronic commerce transaction volumes. Hundreds of dedicated employees moved purposefully through the open-concept workspaces, their focus intense and driven. The sheer scale of the massive operation spanning 3 continuous floors, connected by a stunning floating glass staircase, was a visual testament to immense, undeniable corporate power. I watched through the transparent walls of my executive suite as Derek halted in his tracks, his eyes darting frantically around the expansive facility. His brain struggled violently to reconcile the pathetic online seller he thought he had married with the billionaire titan who actually owned and commanded this towering empire. My private security detail smoothly intercepted the 2 men escorting them through the bustling corporate floor and guiding them toward my commanding executive suite. I remained seated behind my massive desk, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding authority. I was not alone in the room. Flanking my position were 3 of the most ruthless elite corporate litigators in the entire country. They sat in impeccable, coordinated silence, their posture rigid, armed with thick legal portfolios and an intimidating depth of financial expertise. Derek and his attorney entered the room, and the heavy soundproof doors sealed shut behind them, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the thriving company outside. The atmosphere inside the boardroom immediately dropped to a freezing, suffocating tension. Despite the overwhelming visual evidence of my absolute superiority, Derek's deeply ingrained narcissism absolutely refused to completely surrender. He puffed out his chest, attempting to mask his profound intimidation with aggressive masculine posturing. He aggressively gestured to his legal counsel to begin the proceedings, trying to reclaim his shattered dominance. The attorney opened his briefcase and laid out a series of aggressive demands, outlining a completely delusional strategy based on standard marital property laws. Derek leaned forward, his face flushed with unearned entitlement, presenting a fabricated narrative of his monumental sacrifices during our entire marriage. He audaciously claimed that his mediocre salary as a credit director had been the sole financial pillar holding our lives together. I demanded exactly 50% of my entire corporate structure, arguing that my company could never have survived its infancy without his supposedly generous financial support, providing a safety net for my endeavors. He painted himself as a benevolent provider who was now fully entitled to half of my billion-dollar valuation as his rightful compensation. I did not utter a single syllable in response to his pathetic, greedy monologue. I did not justify my immense success, nor did I entertain his fabricated version of our marital history. Instead, I simply shifted my cold gaze to my lead counsel and offered a subtle, commanding nod. My attorney, a man known for ruthlessly dismantling hostile corporate takeovers, retrieved a single meticulously preserved document from a locked leather folio. With agonizingly slow precision, he slid the heavy parchment across the pristine surface of the glass desk, stopping it exactly in front of the opposing lawyer. The action was executed with the chilling finality of a heavy guillotine dropping. The document was not a new filing, nor was it a desperate attempt to shield my assets after the fact. It was an ironclad, incredibly complex blind trust prenuptial agreement that had been executed and officially filed years ago. I watched Derek's eyes scan the signature line, a sudden flash of terrified recognition breaking through his arrogant facade. The distant memory of signing that exact piece of paper washed over him in real time. Years prior, when my financial platform was rapidly expanding, my legal team had required me to legally secure my mounting assets. I had presented the dense document to Derek under the clever guise of protecting his immaculate credit score from the potential liabilities of my risky small business. Blinded entirely by his own towering ego and terrified that my supposed failures might tarnish his pristine banking reputation, he had eagerly signed the waiver without ever bothering to read the fine print. He had legally, permanently, and voluntarily severed himself from any and all claims to my corporate holdings, intellectual property, and subsidiary trusts. He had confidently locked himself out of a $1 billion empire simply because he was too arrogant to believe a woman could ever build one. Derek's attorney picked up the document, his eyes darting rapidly across the dense, impenetrable legal architecture. I watched the profound shift in the man's demeanor as he fully comprehended the absolute genius of the trap his client had willingly walked into. The attorney instantly recognized the signatures of the elite trust lawyers who had drafted the restrictive clauses. I knew immediately that the agreement was completely bulletproof, designed specifically to withstand the most aggressive legal scrutiny imaginable. The color rapidly drained from the attorney's face, his aggressive predatory posture collapsing into profound professional defeat. He slowly lowered the crushing document back to the glass desk. Without making eye contact with his client, the lawyer quietly closed his sleek briefcase and snapped the golden clasps shut. It was a universal silent gesture of total surrender, communicating with devastating clarity that the case was entirely unwinnable and that Derek was walking away with absolutely nothing. Derek stared at his lawyer in absolute shock, his mouth opening and closing silently as the catastrophic reality of his situation finally breached his thick skull. The 50% stake he had greedily anticipated, the massive financial payout he thought would save him from his mounting fraudulent debts, vanished entirely into thin air. He was completely isolated, stripped of his false authority, and legally barred from touching a single cent of my vast wealth. I was nothing but a broken, desperate man, sitting in a majestic empire he could never claim. His entire identity, built on financial superiority and control, had been systematically eradicated by a single signature he provided years ago. But the financial severing was merely the defensive phase of my carefully orchestrated strategy. I had absolutely no intention of allowing him to simply walk away empty-handed. I intended to ensure he walked away, facing a relentless federal investigation. Maintaining my cold, serene composure, I reached into the deep, secure drawer of my executive desk. My fingers curled securely around the thick, heavy folder containing the damning digital payload I had extracted from his compromised banking interface the previous night. The divorce was efficiently settled, but the brutal reckoning for his criminal arrogance was just beginning. With a smooth, calculated motion, I slid the dense folder of his fraudulent banking logs and unauthorized embezzlement records across the glass desk, stopping it right over his useless prenuptial demand. The glossy cover of the folder seemed to absorb the ambient light in the room, radiating a heavy, undeniable sense of impending doom. Derek glanced down at the innocuous-looking file, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as a new wave of raw terror washed over his features. He did not yet know the specific contents hidden within those bound pages, but the lethal precision of my movements promised absolute devastation. The brilliant morning light pouring through the boardroom windows offered him no warmth, only a harsh, glaring illumination of his spectacular downfall. The fortress he thought he could conquer had transformed into an inescapable prison of his own making. The final trap was sprung perfectly, trapping the man who had vastly underestimated the quiet woman waiting patiently in the shadows. His destruction was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate and unavoidable certainty. I watched Derek's gaze fixate on the glossy cover of the dossier resting between us. The boardroom's silence amplified the erratic hitch in his breathing. I reached across and flipped open the heavy cover, exposing the meticulous architecture of his financial ruin. The top page featured a printout of his internal banking dashboard, highlighting the restricted administrative portal he utilized daily as a credit director. I traced my finger along the columns, silently directing his terrified attention to the undeniable anomalies buried deep within the institutional ledgers. I broke down his clandestine operations with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor dissecting a corporate crime scene. I guided his panicked eyes through the labyrinth of shadow accounts he had frantically established over the past 6 months. The data clearly illustrated a reckless escalation of financial manipulation. In his consuming drive to project immense generational wealth to Jamal's affluent family, Derek had leveraged completely non-existent assets. I had manipulated the algorithms he was hired to oversee, fabricating collateral out of thin air to underwrite massive personal loans. I watched his throat swallow hard as the spreadsheet revealed how he bypassed risk assessment protocols, arrogantly assuming his managerial clearance granted him absolute invisibility. He had treated his employer's vaults as a personal slush fund, pulling exorbitant capital to finance the fragile illusion his mother desperately required to secure Vanessa's engagement. He had systematically betrayed his professional oaths, recklessly gambling with institutional funds under the delusional assumption that his fraudulent activities would remain buried beneath layers of corporate bureaucracy. He attempted a pathetic pantomime of desperate denial. He shook his head aggressively, pushing his sweaty palms flat against the glass desk, trying to physically distance himself from the damning paperwork. He mouthed frantic objections, waving his hands in erratic gestures, as if he could simply wave away the cryptographic proof of his mounting federal offenses. I did not entertain his frantic performance or acknowledge his pleas for a reprieve. I simply turned to the next section of the comprehensive dossier. Here, the sterile banking ledgers gave way to time-stamped photographs and exorbitant luxury retail receipts. I presented the perfectly synchronized timeline linking the exact moments the fraudulent loans hit his shadow accounts to the immediate grotesque expenditures that rapidly followed. I laid out the receipt for the diamond tennis bracelet, positioning it next to the bank transfer record that had successfully funded the illicit purchase. I revealed the lease agreements for the luxury sports car and the exorbitant invoices for five-star weekend getaways, matching each luxury expenditure to a specific illegally secured loan disbursement. I then slid the final, most devastating piece of visual evidence forward across the desk. It was a high-definition photograph extracted directly from his own hidden digital backups, showing Paige, the known corporate embezzler, and my former terminated intern, draped casually in the expensive jewelry purchased exclusively with stolen institutional funds. The realization hit him with the crushing force of a physical blow. I made sure he fully comprehended the catastrophic gravity of his deteriorating situation. He had not merely violated the sanctity of our marriage with a cheap affair. He had orchestrated a massive systematic wire fraud operation. He had crossed the definitive line from a deceitful, arrogant spouse to an undeniable federal criminal. The stark reality of his actions stripped away any remaining illusions he held about his own perceived superiority. The heavy realization of this criminality permeated the silent boardroom. Derek's divorce attorney, who had been carefully observing the devastating presentation, visibly recoiled from the table. The predatory confidence the lawyer had marched in with evaporated, replaced instantly by an urgent need for immediate self-preservation. I watched the attorney subtly shift his leather chair backward, creating a deliberate, noticeable physical gap between himself and his suddenly toxic client. An attorney representing a greedy spouse. Seeking $500 million fortune was one thing. An attorney unwittingly sitting beside an active federal fraudster facing impending indictment was an entirely different, highly dangerous liability. The lawyer methodically gathered his remaining blank legal pads and expensive pens, adamantly refusing to make eye contact with the broken man he had confidently represented just 10 minutes prior. He silently but decisively abandoned his client to the merciless machinery of the federal justice system, prioritizing his own immaculate professional reputation over any lingering sense of legal duty. The suffocating tension inside the room was abruptly shattered by a sharp, aggressive vibration rattling against the tempered glass desk. Derek's personal cell phone, resting near his tightly clenched fist, had suddenly illuminated with an incoming call. The caller identification prominently displayed the highly restricted internal extension of his bank's primary security and executive compliance division. It was the exact division he had arrogantly assumed would never possess the capability to catch him in his complex web of lies. I watched the absolute last remaining trace of color drain rapidly from his face, leaving his skin an unnatural, sickly pale hue. His hands shook with violent tremors as he reached out and hesitantly accepted the incoming communication, bringing the device slowly to his ear. I remained perfectly still, observing the catastrophic implosion of his entire fabricated reality play out across his terrified, sweating features. Though I could not hear the specific words being spoken by the stern executive on the other end of the line, the sheer devastation registering in his wide eyes communicated everything. He was being formally informed of his immediate unceremonious termination from the prestigious institution he had used as a personal playground. He received harsh confirmation that his administrative access, corporate email accounts, and physical building entry privileges had been permanently revoked. But the true paralyzing terror set in a few agonizing moments later. I watched his chest heave in shallow, frantic gasps as he absorbed the final crushing blow delivered by the compliance officer. The stern voice on the line was actively notifying him that relentless internal investigators had already uncovered the massive discrepancies buried within his lending portfolio. Furthermore, the bank's aggressive legal department had subsequently transferred all preliminary findings alongside his forged collateral documents directly to federal authorities. The exact same comprehensive data packets I had meticulously compiled and securely transmitted the night before were currently sitting wide open on the desk of ruthless federal prosecutors. The ringing phone slipped from his slick, trembling fingers, clattering against the glass surface of the desk, before tumbling helplessly onto the plush carpet below. The arrogant man who stormed into my corporate headquarters demanding half of my hard-earned empire completely ceased to exist. His physical structure gave way under the immense pressure of his shattered life. His knees buckled, failing utterly to support the sudden crushing weight of his impending unavoidable incarceration. He sank rapidly downward, his expensive custom-tailored suit wrinkling awkwardly as he collapsed directly onto the floor in the absolute center of my immaculate executive suite. He landed hard on his knees right at the edge of my desk, a pathetic broken shell of his former boastful self. The grand facade of the superior breadwinning husband was entirely spectacularly eradicated. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes brimming with absolute unadulterated desperation and raw, primal fear. He began to beg, abandoning all remaining remnants of masculine pride, social dignity, and arrogant entitlement. He frantically pleaded for a miraculous, immediate financial bailout, his hands gripping the cool edge of the glass desk as if I were his only remaining sturdy lifeline in a violent storm. He desperately implored me to utilize my vast, newly discovered billionaire wealth to quietly cover the enormous gaping deficit he had recklessly created in the bank's ledgers. He begged me to leverage my towering corporate influence to somehow placate the furious banking officials to pay off the fraudulent high-risk loans in full before the authorities could officially move. He desperately wanted me to deploy my elite, undefeated legal team to shield his fragile existence from the impending, unavoidable federal indictment bearing down on him. He promised endless subservience, frantically bartering his non-existent future in exchange for an unearned rescue from the harsh prison sentence looming directly ahead of him. I looked down at the groveling man clinging to the edge of my desk, feeling nothing but a profound clinical detachment. His frantic, wordless pleas for salvation echoed pointlessly against the thick, soundproof glass walls of my secure corporate sanctuary. I did not offer a single comforting gesture, nor did I entertain his desperate, pathetic bartering for a future he had already completely destroyed. Maintaining the same cold, unyielding composure that had flawlessly guided my every calculated move, thus far, I simply extended my right index finger toward the sleek, modern communication console resting quietly beside my keyboard. Without breaking intense eye contact with the ruined man, pleading desperately for his freedom, I firmly pressed the glowing silver intercom button, silently summoning my private security force to immediately remove the criminal wreckage from my pristine office. The heavy doors clicked open, marking the absolute end of his disrespect. My private security team entered the boardroom with silent efficiency, immediately responding to the intercom summons. Two heavily built men grasped Derek by his upper arms, hoisting his limp, defeated body from the pristine carpet of my executive suite. He offered zero physical resistance, his spirit completely shattered by the crushing weight of his impending federal indictment. I watched with profound clinical detachment as they dragged him backward, his expensive custom leather shoes scraping uselessly across the floorboards. The heavy glass doors swung shut with a definitive mechanical click, sealing his toxic presence outside my corporate sanctuary forever. The cleanup was instantaneous, leaving absolutely no trace of his pathetic breakdown. My legal team methodically gathered their extensive dossiers and quietly exited, leaving me alone to enjoy the absolute tranquility of my towering empire. The first parasitic element of my fabricated suburban life had been successfully eradicated, but the deeply entrenched rot of his family still required meticulous extraction. I spent the remainder of the afternoon finalizing critical financial partnerships, completely unbothered by the catastrophic ruin currently swallowing my soon-to-be ex-husband. I operated with a renewed sense of unbridled focus, executing complex corporate maneuvers, while knowing the man who called me an embarrassment was currently sitting in a cold interrogation room. As the late afternoon sun began to cast long golden shadows across the sprawling Chicago skyline, I decided to return to my luxury penthouse to prepare for the final stages of my calculated retribution. My private driver navigated the armored town car through the bustling downtown traffic, pulling smoothly into the subterranean VIP entrance of my designated hotel. The harsh fluorescent lights of the underground facility, killers. I stepped out into the climate-controlled parking sector, flanked immediately by my close personal protection detail. As we approached the restricted biometric elevators, a frantic, disheveled figure abruptly lunged from the gloom, attempting to aggressively breach the secure perimeter. My guards instantly intercepted the threat, pushing the erratic intruder back with practiced physical force. I raised a single commanding hand, instructing my team to stand down, as I recognized the pathetic weeping woman struggling helplessly against their iron grip. It was Beatrice, the impeccably groomed, arrogant matriarch who had spent years treating me like a disposable servant, was now completely unrecognizable. Her expensive designer clothing was heavily rumpled. Her carefully sprayed hair was clinging wildly to her damp face, and her usually haughty posture had collapsed into pure, unadulterated panic. With Vanessa and Jamal's extravagant wedding, precisely 48 hours away, Beatrice had clearly realized that her entire fabricated universe was standing precariously on the precipice of absolute total destruction. She had bypassed the hotel's exterior security measures and waited in the freezing garage, driven by a desperate, frantic need to secure the one location that could temporarily mask their impending ruin. Beatrice knew with terrifying, agonizing certainty that losing access to the $9,800,000 Gold Coast mansion would instantly expose their complete financial destitution to Jamal's elite, highly respected family. The cancellation of the venue would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction, violently tearing down the elaborate facade of generational wealth she had so desperately constructed over the past decade. Jamal's parents would immediately uncover the staggering hidden debts, the fraudulent credit lines, and the utter moral bankruptcy of the family their successful son was preparing to marry into. Beatrice was driven by a feral, blinding terror, terrified of facing the absolute social annihilation that awaited her in the upper-class circles she constantly sought to impress. She had come to beg the very woman she had relentlessly abused, relying on a profoundly misguided assumption that my previous silent obedience could somehow be weaponized to save her drowning family. Her chest heaved with erratic, ragged breaths as she stared at my immaculate designer suit, finally comprehending the immense, insurmountable power dynamic that now defined our relationship. I stood perfectly still, observing her frantic, erratic movements with a cold, highly analytical gaze. Beatrice abandoned all remaining remnants of her carefully curated dignity right there on the oil-stained concrete floor of the parking garage. Her knees buckled violently, and she dropped heavily to the ground, clutching desperately at the sharply tailored hem of my charcoal trousers. She resorted to frantic, tearful supplication, her voice echoing off the concrete walls in a pathetic, grotesque display of absolute surrender. She wildly pleaded for permission to utilize the grand mansion just for the limited duration of the wedding ceremony, begging for a single day of grace to ensure Vanessa could successfully secure her lucrative marriage to Jamal. She offered hollow, worthless promises of future servitude, insisting that she would vanish from my life forever if I simply granted them this one monumental favor. I looked down at the weeping woman, feeling a profound sense of poetic irony washing over the bleak subterranean scene. The tyrannical matriarch had voluntarily thrown herself at the feet of the peasant she had actively tried to destroy. I allowed the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch, savoring her agonizing desperation, before slowly signaling to my executive assistant, who stood quietly in the shadows, holding a sleek leather folio. I communicated my conditional agreement to her desperate request, outlining a severe non-negotiable parameter that required her absolute total compliance. My assistant stepped forward, withdrawing a freshly drafted, heavily vetted legal document from the dark leather folio and presenting it directly to the kneeling woman. I methodically articulated the exact terrifying nature of the paperwork she was required to sign in exchange for temporary restricted access to the estate. The contract was a brutal, ironclad confession, binding her permanently to the undeniable truth of her pathetic existence. By signing the document, Beatrice would formally and legally admit to her complete devastating financial insolvency. She would officially confess to her total reliance on my hidden wealth to fund her extravagant, fraudulent lifestyle, explicitly documenting her active complicity in the toxic deceit Derek had perpetrated against me. The paperwork legally stripped away every single lie she had ever told, providing me with undeniable written proof of her absolute moral and financial bankruptcy. It was a tangible weapon designed to permanently neutralize any future attempts she might make to twist the narrative or victimize my reputation in the aftermath of her family's total collapse. Furthermore, I detailed a secondary, incredibly aggressive clause buried deep within the binding legal text of the confession. The document contained a comprehensive, ruthless non-disclosure and media rights transfer agreement. By placing her signature on the dotted line, Beatrice would instantly surrender absolute uncontested ownership of all audiovisual rights, broadcasting capabilities, and digital display permissions associated with the entire wedding event directly to my corporate holding entity. She would legally grant me total unmitigated control over every screen, every speaker, and every piece of recorded media at the extravagant reception. I ensured she fully comprehended that this contractual surrender was the absolute mandatory price for opening the heavy oak doors of the Gold Coast mansion for her daughter's ceremony. I offered absolutely no room for negotiation, no opportunity for independent legal review, and absolutely no mercy in my chilling delivery. It was a flawless, inescapable trap designed to secure the ultimate leverage over a family that had spent years treating my very existence as an embarrassing liability. The power to completely dictate the visual and auditory experience of the most important day of their lives was now securely resting in my hands. Driven by blind, animalistic panic and the desperate, all-consuming need to save face in front of Jamal's powerful family for just one more day, Beatrice did not hesitate or question the severe stipulations. She aggressively snatched the expensive fountain pen from my assistant's extended hand. Her manicured hands shook violently as she scrawled her signature across the crisp pages, carelessly trading her permanent, undeniable dignity for a temporary, fleeting illusion of success. She blindly, legally bound herself to her own spectacular destruction without ever pausing to consider the catastrophic implications of the fine print she had just blindly authorized. My assistant smoothly retrieved the executed contract, securing the damning confession safely back inside the protective leather folio. Maintaining my cold, serene composure, I reached into my designer handbag and withdrew a sleek, heavy digital keycard. I dropped the black plastic square onto the cold concrete directly in front of her kneeling figure, officially granting her 24-hour access to the spectacular estate. She scrambled eagerly forward, grasping the small card as if it were a physical lifeline, completely oblivious to the invisible noose wrapped securely around her neck. I stepped gracefully around her weeping, pathetic form and walked toward the waiting private elevator, a chilling, genuine smile slowly forming on my lips. I knew with absolute flawless certainty that the upcoming grand wedding was no longer a joyous celebration, but the perfectly rigged, inescapable stage for my ultimate, devastating final act. 48 hours later, the sun rose over the Gold Coast, casting a brilliant, warm light across the sprawling $9,800,000 estate. The morning of the wedding had arrived, and the mansion had been transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of fabricated royalty. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded down the grand floating staircase, and delicate silk drapery hung from the vaulted ceilings, transforming the main hall into a breathtaking opulent wonderland. A classical string quartet was already positioned on the elevated marble terrace tuning their instruments, while an army of elite caterers circulated with crystal trays of vintage champagne and rare hors d'oeuvres. To the hundreds of high society guests arriving through the wrought iron gates, it looked like the pinnacle of generational wealth and undeniable social triumph. It was the exact lavish showcase Beatrice had spent years desperately dreaming about. However, behind the impenetrable biometric security doors and away from the admiring eyes of the attendees, the atmosphere was entirely suffocating. The spectacular property had morphed into a gilded, suffocating cage for the very people attempting to claim it. Beatrice and Derek were trapped performing the grueling roles of gracious, wealthy hosts, while a primal, all-consuming terror radiated from their every movement. Beatrice had spent the entire morning pacing erratically through the hidden service corridors, her impeccably styled hair beginning to fray at the edges. The ironclad confession she had signed exchanging her dignity and media rights for a single day of access hung over her head like a suspended blade. She was jumping at every shadow, her eyes darting nervously toward the smart home surveillance cameras she knew I actively controlled. She was forced to smile at passing dignitaries and affluent relatives while harboring the terrifying knowledge that her complete financial destitution could be exposed at any given second. She barked frantic, erratic orders at the floral arrangers, attempting to exert some fleeting semblance of control over a situation that had entirely slipped from her grasp. Derek was unraveling even faster than his mother. He stood near the shadow of a massive marble pillar, sweating profusely inside his custom-tailored tuxedo. The arrogant banking director who had confidently demanded half of my corporate empire just days ago was now a twitching, paranoid wreck. He constantly dabbed his forehead with a monogrammed silk handkerchief, his eyes scanning the crowd with pure, unadulterated dread. The guest list, carefully curated, months in advance by Vanessa, included several high-ranking executives and senior partners from the very financial institution that had just terminated him for massive federal credit fraud. Derek was actively hiding in his own supposed home, terrified of making eye contact with former colleagues who might already know about his impending criminal indictment. He shrank back against the cold stone every time a familiar face passed by, physically attempting to make himself invisible. The heavy burden of his stolen funds, the secret shadow accounts, and the luxury gifts he had purchased for his fraudulent mistress weighed him down until he could barely stand upright. He was completely isolated, unable to confide in his oblivious sister or seek comfort from his equally doomed mother. I was merely counting the agonizing minutes, dreading the catastrophic shoe that was destined to drop. The chaotic, nervous energy, vibrating from my in-laws, was sharply interrupted by my arrival. I did not slip in through a side door or attempt to blend in with the arriving crowds. I made my entrance through the main grand foyer, ensuring my presence commanded absolute immediate attention. I had abandoned the sharp corporate armor from the boardroom, opting instead for a breathtaking floor-length emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly across my silhouette. The deep, rich color contrasted sharply against the sea of muted pastels worn by the other guests, radiating an aura of quiet, lethal power. The delicate diamond tennis bracelet I had purchased for myself years ago caught the light from the cascading chandeliers, sparking brilliant flashes across the room. The moment my stilettos crossed the threshold, the ambient chatter in the grand hall noticeably dipped. The sheer, undeniable authority I projected forced the crowd to naturally part, allowing me a clear, unobstructed path toward the reception area. I bypassed the standard seating arrangements, entirely ignoring the designated placement cards Beatrice had frantically tried to organize. I walked with deliberate, unhurried grace directly toward the primary elevated head table. I took my rightful seat at the absolute center of the VIP section, positioning myself squarely alongside Jamal's distinguished parents. They welcomed me with warm, genuine smiles of profound respect, acknowledging the immense corporate partnership we had recently forged. Sitting at the pinnacle of the room, I held a flawless vantage point over the entire extravagant production. My placement beside the esteemed African American family visually solidified my true status, elevating me far above the desperate scrambling of the people who had called me an embarrassment. From my elevated position, I watched Derek physically recoil as he spotted me. I was immediately relegated to the far dark corners of the background, completely overshadowed and powerless to approach the VIP section. He watched with a sickly pale expression as the billionaire executives from his former bank walked past him without a second glance, making a direct line to shake my hand and offer their professional regards. His ultimate humiliation was playing out in real time as he was forced to watch the woman he had relentlessly belittled effortlessly command the respect of the very titans he had committed federal crimes to impress. He was a spectator at his own execution, powerless to intervene or alter the devastating trajectory of the evening. While her mother and brother were drowning in an ocean of quiet terror, Vanessa remained spectacularly oblivious to the impending doom surrounding her. She floated through the grand hall, swathed in layers of imported designer lace, acting like a completely entitled diva. She snapped her fingers at the catering staff, complaining loudly about the temperature of the champagne and demanding constant, absolute perfection. She was entirely intoxicated by the illusion of her family's boundless wealth, believing she had successfully secured her permanent place among the city's elite. She twirled her diamond engagement ring, oblivious to the fact that it was purchased on a foundation of lies and staggering debt. However, the man standing beside her was not nearly as blind. Jamal remained profoundly quiet, his highly observant nature picking up on the glaring, terrifying inconsistencies fracturing the event. A brilliant entrepreneur raised with strict principles of honor and integrity, Jamal was analyzing the bizarre toxic undercurrents flowing through the room. He stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching the interactions with a sharp, analytical gaze. He noticed the visceral, raw terror in Derek's eyes, observing how his future brother-in-law flinched violently every time a door opened or a glass clinked. He watched Beatrice's manic, erratic behavior, tracking the way her shoulders stiffened and her breath hitched whenever I simply glanced in her general direction. Jamal saw the profound, undeniable fear my presence commanded, and his sharp mind began assembling the broken pieces of their fabricated reality. He looked at the extravagant $9,800,000 mansion, then at the sweating, terrified faces of his future in-laws, and finally at me sitting with absolute serene control beside his respected parents. The deep-seated suspicion that had taken root during the disastrous rehearsal dinner was rapidly blossoming into full-blown clarity. He recognized that Vanessa's family was harboring a massive, catastrophic secret, and that the opulent display surrounding them was nothing more than a hollow, fragile shell waiting to be crushed. The tension in the grand hall continued to stretch, pulling tighter and tighter until the atmosphere felt entirely combustible. The extravagant evening adhered strictly to the meticulously planned schedule, moving seamlessly from the lavish multi-course dinner to the traditional ceremonial events. The ambient lighting dimmed slightly, casting a warm, romantic glow over the center of the room as the massive five-tier wedding cake was rolled onto the polished marble floor. The murmuring crowd gathered around the perimeter, forming a wide circle of anticipation. The classical string quartet positioned on the terrace smoothly transitioned their music, beginning to play a sweeping, elegant melody specifically chosen for the cake-cutting ceremony. Vanessa beamed with manufactured joy, gripping a silver cake knife, while Jamal stood rigidly beside her, his expression unreadable and tense. I remained seated at the VIP table, lifting my crystal glass of vintage champagne to my lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip as I watched the grand finale approach. Just as Vanessa raised her hand to slice into the pristine white fondant, the heavy oak doors of the grand mansion violently swung open. Brilliant flashing blue and red police lights immediately reflected off the pristine, polished marble floors inside. The heavy oak doors slammed against the interior walls with a resounding crash that completely shattered the manufactured elegance of the reception. A team of 6 uniformed police officers, flanked by 2 stern-looking federal agents in dark suits, marched decisively into the grand hall. The synchronized heavy tread of their tactical boots against the imported marble floor echoed loudly, slicing through the delicate classical melody of the string quartet. The musicians abruptly stopped playing their bows, freezing midair. A wave of profound collective shock rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. Champagne flutes paused halfway to parted lips, and the ambient murmur of high society chatter evaporated into a thick, suffocating silence. The flashing blue and red lights from the cruisers parked in the circular driveway pulsed aggressively through the massive front windows, casting harsh, frantic shadows across the lavish floral arrangements. Vanessa stood frozen at the center of the dance floor, her silver cake knife suspended above the pristine white fondant, her meticulously crafted bridal facade crumbling into raw confusion. She naturally assumed the intrusion was a catastrophic misunderstanding, anticipating that the authorities would immediately apologize for disrupting such an exclusive gathering. But the commanding officers did not even acknowledge the bride or the towering wedding cake. They bypassed the center stage entirely, their eyes locked onto a specific target hiding in the perimeter shadows. I remained perfectly seated at the VIP table, my emerald green silk gown catching the erratic police lights. I took another slow, methodical sip of my vintage champagne, observing the scene unfold with absolute cold detachment. The authorities moved with relentless precision, cutting a direct path through the sea of terrified guests. They were heading straight for the dimly lit corner where Derek had been desperately trying to conceal himself for the past 3 hours. As the officers closed in, the affluent attendees instinctively backed away, treating my husband like a sudden infectious liability. Derek backed himself into a massive stone pillar, his broad shoulders trembling violently, his custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. He raised his hands in a frantic, erratic gesture of surrender, his face drained of all color. The arrogant banking director, who had spent years belittling my existence, was now reduced to a cornered, sweating animal, trapped under the unforgiving glare of hundreds of wealthy spectators. His profound realization that the digital trap had finally snapped shut manifested in a sickening display of pure physical terror. The lead federal agent stepped forward and loudly articulated the devastating nature of the intrusion. He informed Derek that he was being placed under immediate arrest. The agent did not lower his voice, ensuring the severe federal charges echoed clearly across the silent reception hall. He specifically cited multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and the unauthorized manipulation of institutional credit lines. The specific financial crimes I had meticulously exposed using my encrypted corporate dashboard were now being broadcast to the exact high society audience Derek had destroyed his life to impress. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting securely around Derek's wrists, resonated through the room. The sound was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of his absolute ruin. His former banking colleagues, the elite executives he had invited to witness his fabricated triumph, watched in profound, disgusted silence as their former peer was physically restrained like a common thief. The polished veneer of his successful career was permanently stripped away, leaving nothing but the pathetic reality of a desperate corporate criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The realization of her son's federal arrest and the total instantaneous annihilation of her family's social standing hit Beatrice with the force of a freight train. She had spent the entire evening pacing the service corridors, terrified of losing access to the mansion, but the reality of a public criminal takedown was a nightmare she had never anticipated. Beatrice unleashed a piercing theatrical scream that shattered the remaining tension in the room. She threw her hands in the air, grasping wildly at her expensive pearl necklace, before dramatically collapsing backward into a fragile gilded chair. She clutched her chest, gasping for air in a grotesque display of manufactured agony, hoping to draw sympathy from the horrified onlookers. She wailed about the injustice of the situation, desperately trying to perform the role of a devastated, oblivious matriarch whose innocent family was being wrongly persecuted. But the elite guests surrounding her offered no comfort. They merely stared down at her weeping, pathetic form, recognizing the unmistakable stench of a massive financial scandal. Her desperate attempts to salvage her fabricated dignity only magnified the sheer pathetic nature of her complete downfall, cementing her status as a complete societal pariah. As the tactical officers forcefully pivoted Derek toward the main exit, his shattered pride violently mutated into a frantic, unhinged rage. He realized that his entire carefully constructed universe was permanently destroyed, and the agonizing humiliation of being paraded in handcuffs in front of Jamal's powerful family finally broke his mind. He planted his expensive leather shoes against the marble floor, desperately resisting the officers, as he twisted his upper body back toward the crowd. His panicked, crazed eyes locked directly onto my calm, seated figure at the VIP table. He abandoned all remaining remnants of self-preservation and launched into a volatile, screaming tirade. He aggressively projected his guilt, attempting to weaponize the public spectacle against me. He bellowed to the shocked audience that he was entirely innocent, claiming that I was a vengeful, evil wife who had meticulously orchestrated this entire criminal takedown. He screamed that I had maliciously hacked his secure banking credentials and planted the fabricated evidence out of pure spite to ruin his family's impeccable reputation. He wildly accused me of trapping him in a complex digital web, desperately trying to convince the elite crowd that I was the true villain of the evening. His desperate flailing was a pathetic attempt to shift the immense burden of his own catastrophic failures onto the woman who had simply stopped covering his tracks. His frantic, desperate accusations hung heavily in the chilled air of the reception hall. The sheer volume and aggressive conviction of his screams caused a distinct, uncomfortable ripple to spread through the affluent crowd. Human nature thrives on scandal, and Derek's wild assertions provided a sudden, confusing twist to the unfolding drama. Whispers ignited among the hundreds of guests, spreading like a localized wildfire. Eyes darted rapidly between Derek's struggling handcuffed form and my completely unbothered posture at the head table. I could feel the heavy weight of mounting suspicion settling over the room. Several high-ranking executives and distant relatives leaned toward one another, murmuring quiet questions about my true involvement. The guests who only moments ago had revered my billionaire status alongside Jamal's parents were now looking at me with distinct, cautious skepticism. Derek was desperately attempting to drag me down into the muddy abyss of his own spectacular failure, relying on the deeply ingrained societal bias that a scorned woman would naturally resort to underhanded, malicious sabotage. He wanted the crowd to believe that his catastrophic ruin was not the result of his own rampant greed, but rather the calculated vengeance of an unstable, vindictive spouse willing to destroy a wedding just to settle a personal vendetta. The federal agents tightened their iron grip on Derek's arms, forcing him toward the flashing lights waiting outside. His voice grew hoarse as he continued hurling vicious, unhinged accusations, attempting to inflict maximum collateral damage before being swallowed by the justice system. The ambient whispers in the grand hall grew noticeably louder, the wealthy guests consuming the toxic narrative he fed them. A lesser woman might have shrunk back under their collective suspicious glares. A weaker person might have summoned her legal team and rushed out a secure exit to avoid the escalating public controversy. I had not spent a decade building a billion-dollar financial technology empire to be intimidated by the desperate lies of a fraudster or the baseless judgments of a fabricated high society crowd. I had systematically stripped away every single layer of their deception and refused to allow my defining moment of liberation to be tainted by his deflection. Maintaining my serene composure, I placed my crystal champagne flute onto the pristine tablecloth. I smoothed the flawless silk of my emerald green gown, ensuring my posture radiated absolute, undeniable dominance. I slowly stood up from the VIP table, ignoring the alarmed, concerned glances from Jamal's parents. The murmurs instantly hushed as I stepped forward, my stilettos clicking sharply against the marble floor with methodical, rhythmic purpose. I did not retreat into the shadows, nor did I attempt to verbally defend myself from my seat. Instead, I walked with powerful, calculated grace, cutting a direct path across the grand reception hall, heading straight toward the elevated platform of the professional disc jockey booth. The final unmasking required a much larger stage, and I was fully prepared to deliver the absolute, undeniable truth to every single person in the room. I ascended the short flight of velvet-covered stairs, leading directly to the professional audio mixing station. The resident disc jockey, A young man hired specifically to curate the evening's romantic ambiance shrank back against his equipment racks as I approached. My emerald green silk gown rustled softly against the metallic edges of the soundboard. I did not ask for permission, nor did I wait for a polite introduction. I simply extended my right hand and firmly gripped the sleek wireless microphone resting on the primary console. The sheer, unyielding authority radiating from my posture paralyzed any potential objections the technical staff might have offered. I turned to face the sprawling reception hall, looking down at the sea of affluent guests, the bewildered family members, and the federal agents who had temporarily paused their extraction of my soon-to-be ex-husband. Derek was still thrashing against his heavy steel restraints. His face contorted into a grotesque mask of desperate fury, continuing to spew venomous lies about my supposed malicious sabotage. He wanted the elite crowd to believe his catastrophic downfall was a hysterical feminine conspiracy rather than the inevitable result of his own monumental greed. I refused to let him spin the false narrative for a single second longer. I raised the microphone to my lips. A sharp, piercing feedback squeal echoed through the towering vaulted ceilings, instantly commanding the absolute attention of every single individual present. The ambient whispers and frantic murmurs instantly evaporated into a thick, suffocating silence. I looked directly toward the back of the grand hall, where my trusted executive assistant stood quietly in the shadows, near the primary audiovisual control panels. I offered a subtle confirming nod, initiating the final devastating phase of my carefully orchestrated plan. The massive high-definition LED screens, suspended majestically above the imported marble dance floor, originally installed to project a heartwarming nostalgic slideshow of Vanessa and Jamal's fabricated courtship, violently flickered to life. The soft ambient lighting of the grand mansion dimmed automatically, seamlessly shifting the entire focus of the crowded room directly to the glowing digital displays. The romantic illusion was abruptly and permanently cancelled. In its place, a crisp, stark white presentation slide illuminated the vast space, exposing the undeniable, brutal reality of the family, desperately attempting to claim this stolen prestige. I held the microphone with a steady, unyielding grip, ensuring my voice projected with absolute chilling clarity across the sprawling estate. I announced to the silent, horrified crowd that the man currently struggling in federal handcuffs was actively attempting to rewrite history to save his shattered ego. I declared that the time for manufactured optics had officially expired, and the absolute truth was now taking center stage. The massive screens flashed instantly, presenting a highly magnified, crystal-clear screenshot of a digital text exchange. It was the exact message Derek had sent me mere days prior. The text was brutally stark, displaying his cruel dismissal of my worth and his arrogant declaration that I was an absolute embarrassment to his family. I read his venomous words aloud, letting the sheer arrogance of his insult wash over the hundreds of elite guests. I watched the faces of Jamal's dignified parents harden as they absorbed the toxic reality of how their future in-laws treated their own family members. Before the stunned crowd could fully process the initial shock, I signaled my assistant once again to deploy the next phase of the digital exhibition. The digital display shifted, instantly projecting a highly detailed, legally certified property deed. The document clearly outlined the purchase of the $9,800,000 Gold Coast mansion where they currently stood. I directed the crowd's attention to the highlighted ownership clause, explicitly proving that the spectacular estate was purchased entirely in cash by a blind corporate entity, completely under my exclusive control. I methodically explained that Beatrice and Derek were completely destitute, harboring zero generational wealth and possessing absolutely no legitimate claim to the lavish surroundings they had been arrogantly boasting about all evening. I revealed that I was the sole legal owner and the exclusive financial benefactor of their entire pathetic existence. A collective gasp rippled through the expansive reception hall as the sophisticated guests fully comprehended the staggering magnitude of the familial deception. Beatrice physically wilted in her gilded chair, burying her tear-stained face in her trembling hands, completely unable to escape the crushing public exposure. The matriarch, who had built her entire identity on the perception of superiority, was now entirely ruined. But the presentation was far from over. The screen transitioned once more, diving straight into the dark, putrid core of Derek's federal criminality. The bright displays now projected a sprawling, complex matrix of internal banking logs, highlighted routing numbers, and unauthorized credit transfers. I calmly articulated the exact mechanics of his corporate embezzlement, explaining precisely how he had manipulated his employer's institutional algorithms to secure massive personal loans using entirely fabricated collateral. I broke down his illicit shadow accounts, exposing how he relentlessly bled his professional integrity dry just to maintain a fragile, pathetic illusion of masculine superiority. The truth was an absolute torrential flood, washing away every single lie they had meticulously crafted to deceive Jamal's honorable family. The final devastating image materialized on the massive high-definition screens suspended above the paralyzed crowd. It was a high-resolution photograph extracted directly from his own hidden digital backups, showing his mistress Paige casually draping herself over a velvet hotel sofa. She was prominently wearing the exact custom diamond tennis bracelet Derek had recently purchased using the stolen institutional funds. I displayed the corresponding luxury jewelry receipt side by side with the wire transfer logs, proving without a single shadow of a doubt that his illicit affair was financed exclusively by his massive federal wire fraud. A shocked murmur ripped through the audience as they recognized the immense scale of his betrayal. Derek abruptly stopped, struggling against the federal agents grasping his arms. The violent fight completely drained from his body as the undeniable cryptographic proof of his pathetic double life illuminated the grand hall for all his former banking colleagues to witness. He stared at the massive screens, his jaw hanging slack, his eyes wide with a terminal, inescapable despair. The intricate web of lies he had desperately spun to protect his fragile masculinity had been systematically, violently dismantled, leaving him entirely exposed as a desperate, thieving fraud. I looked directly down at him from the elevated disc jockey platform, my voice ringing out with icy, flawless precision. I spoke directly into the microphone, ensuring every syllable resonated with absolute, unmistakable finality. I told him clearly that I did not set him up or maliciously orchestrate his criminal downfall. I informed him that I simply stopped cleaning up his pathetic financial messes and allowed his own towering, boundless arrogance to finally permanently destroy him. I lowered the microphone, placing it gently onto the audio console, completing the ultimate unmasking. The absolute reckoning had been fully executed in plain sight. The entire room was paralyzed in a profound, stunned silence. The sheer weight of the brutal revelations completely suffocating the opulent space. No one dared to move or speak as the monumental scale of the family's deep deception hung heavily in the freezing air. The illusion of their pristine high society life was entirely annihilated, leaving nothing but the smoldering wreckage of their own pathetic greed. Vanessa suddenly broke the agonizing quiet, bursting into frantic, hysterical tears that ruined her immaculate bridal makeup. Her perfect manufactured wedding facade instantly shattered as the terrifying reality of her family's complete financial and moral bankruptcy forcefully set in. She desperately turned toward Jamal, reaching out with trembling, manicured hands to grasp his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. She fully expected her honorable, highly respected groom to blindly shield her from the devastating public ruin currently destroying her existence. She clung to the delusional hope that he would somehow prioritize their impending marriage over the undeniable photographic proof of her family's criminal nature. She sobbed loudly, begging him to fix the situation, to make the terrible embarrassment stop right now. But Jamal did not embrace her or offer any soothing words of comfort. His handsome face was an unreadable stoic mask of cold, analytical betrayal. He stared down at her frantic, grasping hands, completely unresponsive to her hysterical demands for rescue. As her fingers aggressively attempted to clutch his silk lapel, Jamal slowly and deliberately pulled his arm away, slipping completely out of her desperate, frantic grasp. He took a single decisive step backward, physically and symbolically, severing his connection to her fraudulent world. The absolute rejection was silent, but its impact resonated with earth-shattering finality, signaling the definitive end of their completely corrupted engagement. He slowly shook his head, refusing to ever let his highly respected family name be permanently associated with such a pathetic and incredibly desperate display of profound moral bankruptcy and financial deceit. Jamal's stepping away from Vanessa's frantic grasp marked a permanent shift in the atmosphere of the grand reception hall. He did not raise his hands in anger or exhibit any erratic behavior typical of a betrayed groom. Instead, he moved with the steady, calculated precision of a man who possessed absolute clarity regarding his own core values and the pristine legacy of his family. He walked past the sobbing bride, leaving her completely stranded in a pool of expensive imported lace on the marble floor. His deliberate strides brought him directly to the elevated disc jockey platform, where I stood watching the fallout of my financial revelations. Jamal climbed the short velvet stairs, his posture radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. He stopped just inches away from me, offering a profound, respectful nod that acknowledged the immense burden I had silently carried while living among his deceitful future-in-laws. He reached out with a steady hand, requesting the wireless microphone I had just used to dismantle the fraudulent empire. I relinquished the device freely, stepping back to allow him the floor, recognizing that his retribution was just as necessary. Jamal turned to face the captivated audience, his presence commanding the immediate, undivided attention of every single high society guest and terrified family member remaining in the room. He addressed the silent crowd with a rich, resonant projection, projecting an aura of profound integrity that completely overshadowed the superficial opulence surrounding them. He directed his opening statements toward his own dignified parents and extended relatives, expressing his deep, sincere regret for bringing them into a toxic environment built entirely on a foundation of desperate financial manipulation. He then shifted his focus back to me, publicly declaring his immense respect for the breathtaking courage it took to stand alone against a family of parasitic grifters. He praised the sheer brilliance of my corporate achievements and validated my decision to surgically expose the criminal rot hiding beneath their fabricated upper-class aesthetic. He made it absolutely clear to the affluent attendees that my actions were not born of petty vengeance, but rather a necessary cleansing of a deeply corrupted system. He ensured that my reputation remained utterly flawless, highlighting my role as a visionary entrepreneur who had been horribly mistreated. With my vindication firmly established before the elite crowd, Jamal pivoted his intense analytical gaze toward the shattered remnants of his impending marriage. He focused entirely on Vanessa, who was currently kneeling on the polished floor, violently smearing her immaculate bridal makeup in a pathetic display of manufactured victimization. Jamal methodically dismantled her desperate attempts to paint herself as an oblivious bystander to her family's monumental federal crimes. He systematically articulated how she was entirely complicit in the toxic culture of unearned entitlement and fabricated wealth, actively benefiting from the very financial fraud that was currently sending her brother to a federal penitentiary. He pointed out the staggering hypocrisy of her demands for absolute perfection, while she was perfectly willing to construct a lifelong marital union entirely funded by stolen institutional capital and the hidden billionaire wealth of a sister-in-law she relentlessly bullied. Jamal exposed her true nature, revealing that she loved the reflection of his generational wealth far more than she ever loved him as an individual partner. Jamal then directed his unwavering judgment toward Beatrice, who was still slumped dramatically in a gilded chair, clutching her chest and attempting to draw sympathetic attention from the disgusted onlookers. He delivered a crushing assessment of her catastrophic failure as a matriarch, highlighting how her relentless, obsessive pursuit of social prestige had completely destroyed the moral compass of her own children. He condemned her willingness to sacrifice basic human decency and ethical boundaries simply to secure a fraudulent position among the city's intellectual elite. He laid the ultimate blame for the entire spectacular disaster squarely at her feet, confirming that her insatiable greed and toxic vanity had permanently ruined any chance her family had at achieving genuine happiness or stability. The harsh, undeniable truth of his assessment stripped away the last remaining shreds of Beatrice's dignity, leaving her completely exposed as the true architect of her family's monumental downfall. The final phase of Jamal's public address carried the heavy, devastating weight of absolute finality. He raised his left hand, inspecting the custom platinum wedding band that rested heavily on his ring finger. The piece of jewelry was meant to symbolize a lifelong partnership built on mutual trust, shared values, and unwavering honesty. With a slow, deliberate motion, Jamal grasped the metal band and slid it smoothly off his finger, permanently severing his connection to their toxic lineage. He held the ring up for the entire silent room to witness, before dropping it onto the floor where it landed with a sharp metallic clatter against the pristine white marble. The sound echoed through the vaulted ceilings, marking the official definitive termination of the highly anticipated union. Jamal announced to his gathered family friends and the surrounding elite guests that the wedding was permanently canceled. There would be no compromises, no secret settlements, and absolutely no path forward for the shattered couple. He refused to allow his family's pristine, hard-earned legacy to be infected by the staggering moral bankruptcy and criminal deceit orchestrated by his former fiancée and her desperate relatives. He made it abundantly clear that his prestigious lineage, built through generations of authentic hard work and legitimate philanthropic success, would never merge with a family of opportunistic fraudsters. He urged his distinguished guests to gather their belongings and depart the contaminated premises, refusing to entertain the grand illusion for a single second longer. His words were a perfect masterclass in dignified boundary setting, proving that true wealth resided in character and integrity rather than stolen capital and rented mansions. He placed the microphone gently onto a nearby wooden table, offering me one final nod of profound solidarity before turning his back completely on the weeping bride and the disgraced matriarch. The departure of Jamal's family was a synchronized display of quiet, unified dignity. His prominent parents, who had warmly embraced me upon their arrival, rose from the primary VIP table with immaculate grace. They did not spare a single glance for Beatrice, or offer any parting words of manufactured sympathy to the sobbing bride on the floor. They simply adjusted their tailored garments and walked steadily toward the main exit, signaling to their extended relatives and affluent associates to follow suit. The mass exodus of the true upper-class guests happened with swift, silent efficiency. The grand reception hall quickly emptied of its most prestigious attendees, leaving behind a haunting visual metaphor of the family's total social annihilation and complete despair. The cascading floral arrangements and imported silk drapery suddenly looked absurdly tragic, surrounding a family that had just lost absolutely everything they had ever schemed to achieve. The rapid departure of the elite guests acted as a catalyst for Vanessa's complete psychological collapse. She descended into a violent, unhinged tantrum, pounding her fists against the cold marble floor and screaming incoherently at the retreating backs of her former future-in-laws. She tore at her expensive lace veil, shredding the delicate fabric in a fit of pure, uncontrollable rage. She frantically blamed her arrested brother, her hyperventilating mother, and the unfair universe for robbing her of the billionaire lifestyle she felt fundamentally entitled to possess. Beatrice watched her daughter's spectacular meltdown with wide, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their collective failure. The opulent $9,800,000 estate had transformed from a glorious stage of triumph into a suffocating, inescapable tomb of their own catastrophic making. Every single lie they had meticulously crafted over the past decade had been systematically hunted down and brutally executed in the span of a single evening. They had nothing left to leverage and nowhere left to hide their absolute shame. The heavy oak doors of the grand mansion remained wide open, allowing the freezing night air to sweep through the desolate reception hall. The flashing emergency lights from the police cruisers had finally faded into the distance, taking the last remaining fragments of Derek's arrogant existence along with them. Beatrice sat shivering in her gilded chair, staring blankly at the ruined five-tier wedding cake, desperately trying to comprehend how she would survive the impending absolute destitution awaiting her at sunrise. She believed with agonizing certainty that the absolute worst possible outcome had already occurred, and that no further humiliation could possibly be inflicted upon her shattered family. The deafening silence of the abandoned ballroom was suddenly and violently pierced by the aggressive, high-pitched screech of high-performance tires tearing up the circular driveway outside. The aggressive roar of a massive engine echoed off the stone facade, followed immediately by the loud, aggressive slamming of a heavy car door directly outside the main entrance. The heavy footsteps approaching the threshold promised another wave of relentless, agonizing consequences. The massive oak doors, already resting wide open from the chaotic federal raid, provided no barrier to the incoming threat. A vibrant, obscenely expensive luxury sports car sat idling erratically on the pristine cobblestone driveway, its hazard lights pulsing a bright, frantic amber against the dark exterior of the estate. The vehicle was a highly customized imported machine, undoubtedly secured through the very same fraudulent shadow accounts that had just sent my husband away in federal handcuffs. Stomping aggressively up the grand marble steps was Paige. The former junior intern recently terminated from my own subsidiary enterprise for corporate embezzlement had arrived at the epicenter of the catastrophe. She was completely swathed in ostentatious designer garments, visually radiating the illicit wealth she had siphoned from Derek's staggering federal wire fraud. Her neck and wrists glittered heavily with the exact custom diamond pieces I had meticulously exposed on the towering digital screens just moments prior. However, Paige had absolutely not arrived to offer comfort, loyalty, or emotional support to a fallen partner in his darkest hour of need. She possessed no intention of standing by the disgraced banking director as he faced the devastating reality of a multi-decade prison sentence. Instead, she marched into the sprawling, devastated reception hall, entirely consumed by a feral, unadulterated fury. The news of the massive institutional lockdown and the immediate freezing of all associated assets had clearly reached her with brutal speed. She had likely attempted to execute another exorbitant luxury purchase only to face the sudden, profound humiliation of a catastrophic terminal decline. Her entire fabricated lifestyle, built exclusively on the foundation of stolen institutional capital, had evaporated the precise second the compliance division locked down those illicit credit lines. She was a predator whose primary highly lucrative food source had just been abruptly and permanently severed, and her outrage was palpable. Paige marched aggressively across the imported marble, her sharp designer stilettos striking the polished floor like violent hammer blows echoing harshly against the vaulted ceilings. She completely ignored the weeping, ruined bride collapsed in the center of the dance floor and bypassed the overturned floral arrangements without a single downward glance. She made a direct, hostile line toward the dimly lit alcove where Beatrice remained slumped in her gilded chair, hyperventilating in a state of absolute catatonic shock. Paige reached deep into her heavily branded handbag, yet another stolen luxury item, and forcefully extracted a thick-banded stack of premium metal credit cards. With a swift, violently aggressive motion, she hurled the entire handful directly downward onto the pristine white marble. The heavy metal cards clattered loudly, scattering aggressively around Beatrice's trembling, expensive footwear. The sharp clinking sound resonated through the desolate space, acting as a brutal auditory confirmation of the family's complete financial annihilation. Every single card lying on the floor was completely declined, maxed out and entirely useless, representing nothing more than the impending, inescapable reality of severe federal prosecution. Paige utilized aggressive, hostile body language to make it abundantly clear that she possessed absolutely zero remaining allegiance to the disgraced banking director. Her loyalty had only ever been tethered to the endless stream of stolen wealth he had fraudulently provided. Now that the illicit funds were completely frozen and the federal authorities were involved, her departure from his life was instantaneous and utterly ruthless. Standing amidst the smoldering wreckage of the extravagant reception, the mistress proceeded to deliver the absolute most devastating psychological blow to the already shattered matriarch. Paige openly and loudly mocked their pathetic, desperate attempts at maintaining a high society illusion. Through a barrage of hostile, mocking gestures and cruel, vindictive posturing, she revealed the staggering depth of Derek's delusional, manipulative promises. She communicated with brutal, theatrical cruelty that the $9,800,000 Gold Coast estate they were currently sitting in was the exact same property Derek had recently promised to purchase for her. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of his lies crashed over Beatrice and Vanessa, exponentially compounding their agonizing, suffocating humiliation. Derek had not only planned to leverage my hidden billionaire wealth to elevate his mother and sister into the elite echelons of society, but he had actively utilized the exact same fabricated ownership to secure the affections of a documented corporate embezzler. He had promised the keys to this magnificent fortress to his fraudulent mistress, running identical overlapping cons on both the women in his family and the woman in his bed. Paige laughed a harsh, grating, and deeply mocking laugh at their collective, undeniable destitution. She rolled her eyes with profound disgust at the shredded imported lace, bridal veils scattered across the floor, and the untouched five-tier wedding cake melting slowly under the ambient lighting. She looked down at Beatrice, her expression conveying nothing but absolute withering contempt for a family that had spent their entire lives pretending to be royalty only to be exposed as pathetic, penniless frauds. Having successfully delivered her final toxic insult and physically discarding the useless plastic remnants of his deceit, Paige turned sharply on her heel. She marched right back out the heavy oak doors, her departure just as abrupt and chaotic as her arrival. She did not spare a single backward glance at the weeping women or the ruined, opulent wonderland. The aggressive roar of the luxury sports car engine flared to life once more, echoing loudly through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. The tires screeched violently against the pristine cobblestone, and she sped away into the freezing night, completely abandoning the ruined family to suffocate in the catastrophic, inescapable wreckage of their own making. The vehicle vanished down the street, taking the absolute last remnant of Derek's fabricated fraudulent existence along with it. I remained standing perfectly still on the elevated disc jockey platform, a silent, absolute sovereign surveying my fully conquered territory. The emerald green silk of my designer gown caught the dim ambient emergency lighting as I slowly, methodically raised my crystal flute. I took one final leisurely sip of the vintage champagne, allowing the crisp, cold liquid to wash over my palate. The intoxicating taste of complete, unmitigated victory was profound. I watched the meticulously constructed decade-long facade of their generational wealth completely and permanently crumble into microscopic dust before my very eyes. There was no more screaming, no more frantic bargaining, and absolutely no more defensive posturing left to be had. The silence of the abandoned ballroom was now absolute, profound, and permanent, broken only by the pathetic, muffled, and entirely ignored sobs of the two women who had spent years attempting to orchestrate my emotional and social destruction. The sheer scale of the devastation was breathtaking, yet it brought me no guilt, no remorse, and absolutely no hesitation. I had simply held up a mirror to their profound moral bankruptcy and allowed the natural, devastating consequences of their own actions to execute the final judgment. They had built their entire identities on the fragile foundation of my silent tolerance, and the moment I removed that support, their universe instantaneously collapsed. I lowered my glass, feeling a profound, deeply resonant sense of total liberation expanding within my chest. The heavy, suffocating burden of pretending to be an embarrassing, low-class burden to appease their towering, fragile egos was officially, permanently eradicated. I was no longer the quiet, supportive wife, I was the billionaire architect of their absolute ruin, and I had reclaimed my narrative with flawless, undeniable precision. I placed the delicate crystal flute gently onto a passing silver tray, abandoned hours ago by the fleeing, terrified catering staff. My gaze swept across the massive empty hall one last time, ensuring the absolute finality of my triumph. Catching the eye of my lead security director, who stood poised and alert near the primary entrance, I offered a single definitive nod. The silent, commanding gesture officially authorized my private tactical team to begin the systematic, uncompromising process of completely clearing all unauthorized occupants from my private property. The security personnel immediately stepped forward, their posture, rigid and authoritative, moving to physically escort the weeping matriarch and the ruined bride out into the freezing reality of their new destitute existence. Without a single backward glance at the pathetic, crumbling remnants of the family that had tried to destroy me, I turned my back on the grand hall. I gracefully descended the short velvet-covered stairs and walked smoothly toward the main doors, stepping effortlessly and confidently into the crisp, cool, and infinitely freeing night air. The night air cleared my lungs as I stepped into the quiet embrace of the sweeping estate grounds. The agonizing hours of darkness slowly bled into a brilliant, unyielding dawn. The morning sun crested over the expansive horizon of Lake Michigan, casting an illuminating light across the sprawling Gold Coast property. The $9,800,000 mansion had been systematically purged of all manufactured opulence. Before the local neighborhood fully awakened, my private security and maintenance crews meticulously cleared the entire property. The cascading imported white orchids were stripped away, the delicate silk draperies were dismantled, and the towering, untouched five-tier wedding cake was discarded into the industrial refuse bins. The property was aggressively cleansed of the toxic, deceptive energy, restoring the magnificent architecture to its pristine, immaculate state. I stood near the towering wrought iron security gates at the end of the immaculate cobblestone driveway, holding a steaming cup of dark roasted coffee. I watched with profound clinical detachment as the final phase of the immediate eviction was flawlessly executed. Beatrice, the once haughty matriarch, who had built her entire existence on the relentless subjugation of others, was being physically escorted off the premises by my lead security director. She possessed absolutely nothing to her name but a single scuffed designer suitcase containing the meager remnants of her curated wardrobe. Her previously immaculate posture had entirely collapsed, her shoulders hunched deeply against the biting morning chill. She violently collapsed against the heavy wrought iron bars, her heavily mascaraed eyes wide with a feral hollow, an entirely consuming panic, desperately begging me for a temporary reprieve, offering empty promises and crying about her sudden homelessness. I did not indulge her desperate groveling, nor did I entertain a single ounce of misplaced sympathy. I reached into the sleek pocket of my tailored charcoal trousers, extracted a single crumpled $20 bill, and pressed it firmly into her trembling, sweaty palm, alongside a neatly printed address for a notoriously cheap, rundown motel located on the absolute furthest outskirts of the city. I looked directly into her terrified, weeping eyes and calmly utilized indirect communication to remind her of the exact harsh philosophy she had gleefully weaponized against me just weeks prior. I made it abundantly clear that individuals who systematically fail at basic human decency simply do not belong in places of immense success. The heavy motorized security gates glided shut with a definitive metallic clash, permanently locking her out of my world forever, leaving her standing alone on the cold suburban sidewalk. The natural, unavoidable, and brutally severe consequences of their monumental deception materialized rapidly over the subsequent months, completely dismantling what little remained of their shattered lives. The federal justice system moved with ruthless, unyielding efficiency against the man who arrogantly assumed his corporate title granted him invisible immunity. Derek was officially convicted on multiple severe counts of aggravated wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and the unauthorized manipulation of institutional credit lines. The presiding federal judge displayed absolutely zero leniency, handing down a devastating multi-decade mandate in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant banking director was instantly reduced to a mere sequential identification number within the sprawling penal system, permanently stripped of his custom-tailored suits and fabricated superiority, completely isolated from the wealthy society he committed crimes to infiltrate. Vanessa, abruptly awakened from her delusional diva fantasy, found herself drowning completely under the crushing, suffocating weight of the exorbitant vendor contracts she had foolishly signed for the cancelled wedding. Abandoned entirely by her disgraced family and profoundly rejected by Jamal, she was forcefully ejected from her pampered, entitled lifestyle. With creditors relentlessly hunting her down, she was compelled to accept a grueling minimum wage retail position at a discount suburban shopping mall. The profound irony of her new existence was staggering. The woman who loudly demanded absolute perfection from elite caterers was now spending her exhausting days folding cheap synthetic garments and enduring the harsh reprimands of teenage shift managers just to appease the relentless collection agencies. Beatrice suffered a fate arguably worse than complete financial ruin, experiencing total, absolute, and permanent social annihilation. The elite high society circles she had spent a decade desperately trying to infiltrate permanently and aggressively blacklisted her name. Her former affluent friends immediately blocked her phone numbers, refusing to be associated with the mother of a convicted federal fraudster. She was forcefully evicted from her remaining properties and forced to relocate to a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment in a heavily neglected neighborhood. She spent her miserable, lonely days completely isolated and entirely shunned, staring blankly at cheap peeling linoleum floors and listening to the relentless police sirens wailing outside, representing a stark, horrific contrast to the cascading crystal chandeliers she had briefly tried to claim as her own. The crippling, deafening silence of her cellular phone was a daily agonizing reminder of her spectacular, humiliating downfall. While they sank into the inescapable abyss of their own making, my personal and professional trajectory skyrocketed into an era of unbridled corporate expansion. I officially reclaimed total ownership of my narrative, refusing to ever shrink my brilliance to accommodate the fragile egos of insecure individuals. I radically transformed the sprawling Gold Coast estate, repurposing the massive $9,800,000 property. I converted the magnificent space into a vibrant, exclusive startup incubator dedicated to funding mentoring and elevating brilliant female entrepreneurs. The grand dining halls where Beatrice attempted her scams were replaced with collaborative glass-enclosed workspaces, state-of-the-art programming hubs, and expansive presentation stages where driven women pitched enterprise concepts. I utilized my vast billionaire resources to ensure other determined women would never hide their brilliance behind oversized sweaters or supportive, quiet facades. Furthermore, the wedding cancellation did not sever my lucrative connection to the individuals who actually possessed genuine character and unwavering integrity. Jamal and his highly respected family maintained their profound professional and personal respect for my executive leadership. The corporate partnership between my financial technology platform and their global investment firm flourished immensely, generating billions in legitimate, ethically sourced revenue. We frequently hosted elite corporate summits within the newly renovated mansion incubator, substituting the toxic relationships of my past with authentic, beneficial alliances built on a bedrock of absolute, undeniable transparency. Jamal frequently visited the estate, collaborating on new ventures and expressing his gratitude for the necessary intervention that saved his family's pristine legacy from Derek's criminal underworld. The realization of my total liberation arrived on a warm, clear evening, exactly 1 year after the spectacular implosion of my fabricated marriage. I walked out onto the elevated marble balcony of the grand mansion, the soft evening breeze catching the edges of my elegant silk attire. The glittering skyline of downtown Chicago stretched out infinitely before me, an endless, breathtaking ocean of illuminated potential and opportunity. The quiet, ambient hum of the thriving, massive city below felt like a flawless symphony of pure, unadulterated triumph. I leaned gracefully against the cool stone balustrade, holding a delicate glass of sparkling water, simply existing in a state of absolute, unshakable peace. The psychological chains of my past were completely shattered. Suddenly, the tranquil silence of the balcony was abruptly interrupted by the harsh mechanical buzzing of my encrypted mobile device resting on a nearby patio table. I picked up the phone, glancing down at the brightly illuminated screen. The caller identification displayed a distinct automated alert, indicating an incoming collect communication originating directly from a high-security federal penitentiary. It was the desperate, pathetic ghost of my past, reaching out from behind thick concrete walls and heavy iron bars, likely hoping to beg for commissary funds or a miraculous legal intervention. I stared at the flashing incoming notification, feeling absolutely nothing inside my chest. No anger, no lingering sorrow, and certainly not a single ounce of pity. The man sitting in that sterile, depressing prison cell was a complete irrelevant and entirely forgotten stranger to the powerful billionaire chief executive officer. Without a single microsecond of hesitation, I firmly pressed the red digital icon to instantly and permanently decline the incoming connection. I smoothly navigated to the advanced security settings and permanently blocked the institutional routing number, ensuring that his desperate, pathetic voice would never again penetrate the impenetrable fortress of my newly constructed reality. I casually tossed the silenced mobile device onto a plush outdoor velvet sofa, dismissing its very existence entirely. I turned my absolute attention back toward the magnificent sprawling cityscape, taking a deep, revitalizing, and incredibly fulfilling breath of the crisp, cool evening air. The oppressive, suffocating weight of my previous existence was permanently and entirely eradicated. I stood completely alone at the absolute brilliant pinnacle of my towering empire, surrounded by the tangible, irrefutable evidence of my own unmatched brilliance and unyielding, fierce resilience. The grand spectacular stage was finally and perfectly cleared, leaving absolutely nothing but the intoxicating, limitless horizon of total unmitigated freedom and absolute undeniable success.